I feel even humble just to take the name. We are truly in the presence of greatness with the next speaker. Maryanne Demasi comes here all the way from Australia for us. She is the Michael Mosley and the Sanjay Gupta of the world. She, in the early 2013, had a great program on Australian Broadcasting Network about cholesterol. And I learned from it at that time, and she's here to mesmerize her and mesmerize us with her talk and her science. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not here to tell you whether you should or shouldn't take statins, but I'm here to give you some insight into what happens behind the scenes with the clinical trials to help inform you of whether you want to take the medications or whether you don't, and if there's doctors in the audience, whether you would want to prescribe these medications. And I'll also talk a little bit about the challenges that I've faced publicly questioning statins, and I'm sure that there are people in the audience that have had similar experiences. All right, so just a little bit about me. I have a PhD in rheumatology from a few years ago. I've also worked as a political advisor and speechwriter for the Minister for Science in South Australia. For over a decade, I worked as a journalist, as a TV presenter and producer for ABC's science program called Catalyst. And ABC in Australia is a wholly government-funded public broadcaster, unlike the ABC here in America. And recently I've been working as a consultant for the Nordic Cochrane collaboration. So I'm here in a personal capacity, and I'm not here to represent the Cochrane collaboration. So my talk today will be referencing much of the stuff that's been published in a paper, the British Journal of Sports Medicine that I wrote earlier this year. Have we been misled by the evidence? And it's fully referenced if you need to grab that paper. So statins are extremely effective at lowering cholesterol, so few people will doubt that. They are the most widely prescribed cholesterol-lowering medications in the world, and an extremely profitable drug class, with Lipitor being the most profitable drug in the history of medicine. And despite the fact that all their patents have expired, total sales are expected to reach $1 trillion by 2020 if the current prescribing guidelines are adhered to. Okay, so we've seen an exponential rise in statins. Originally, we were only suggesting that people at high risk of cardiovascular disease take statins. So these are people who've already had a heart attack or a stroke. But then there was an influential group at Oxford University who suggested that perhaps everybody over the age of 50 should take statins, even if they didn't have high cholesterol. Then a few years ago, we had paediatricians suggesting that we screen children for high cholesterol to find potential recipients for statins, and Pfizer even marketed grape-flavoured statins to appeal to this younger cohort. There was a well-known cardiologist in the UK who also suggested that, and it published this article in the American Journal of Cardiology, that statins should be used as condiments in burger outlets to counter the effects of a fast food meal. And I've even interviewed doctors who have had debates with other doctors about putting statins in the water supply. So we've gone from a very specific group of people to suggesting that statins are so safe and so effective that everybody should be on them. So just this year, in the Journal of Clinical Lipidology, a group of scientists talked about the zero LDL hypothesis, and the article was essentially supporting the safety of extremely low LDL levels. So we're in a situation here where the prevailing view is that when it comes to cholesterol, the lower the better, and if you can get your LDL down to zero, then you won't have a heart attack. So it's developed an acrimonious debate, which is what I call the Statin Wars. We have the proponents saying that they are life-saving drugs, one of the most important advances in medical history, and have prevented untold heart attacks and strokes. On the other hand, we have the skeptics saying, well, they're largely unnecessary, they serve no purpose in lowering cholesterol to prevent cardiac problems. So this rise in skepticism has really arisen from several reasons which I'll go through. Firstly, there's been constantly changing thresholds. In the early 2000s, the US National Cholesterol Education Program revised their definition of what they call high cholesterol. So simply by lowering the threshold, millions more people became eligible for these medications overnight. And it wasn't through any new science, it was just simply by changing the definition of high cholesterol. And of course, there was outrage when it was discovered that 8 out of 9 people on this panel that made that decision actually had ties to statin manufacturers. In 2013, the American College of Cardiologists and the American Heart Association actually moved away from looking at a single cholesterol number, and they moved to a risk-based system, which is what they do now. So when you go to your doctor and he wants to decide what your cardiovascular risk is, they use a calculator and they type in your blood pressure, your weight, your age, your LDL level, and they come up with a percentage. So in America, if the percentage is 7.5% risk of developing cardiovascular disease in the next 10 years, you'll be prescribed a statin. And that's compared to 20% in the UK. And when they shifted to this risk-based analysis, it meant that 12.8 million more Americans would be taking statins. And these were mostly older people without cardiovascular disease. And this is the very population that doesn't benefit from these medications. And there was also a study that looked at the calculators that the doctors use to calculate your risk. And one study found that 4 out of 5 of these calculators overestimated people's risk of cardiovascular disease. One of them was up to 115%. Another reason there's skepticism behind the statin trials is that in the 1980s, the former US President Ronald Reagan significantly slashed funding to the National Institutes of Health. And this allowed private industry to move in and start funding their own clinical trials. And in the case of statins, the vast majority of statin trials are actually funded by industry. Now, there is one publicly funded clinical trial, and that actually showed that statins were not effective at reducing cardiovascular disease. So it's been well established by Cochrane reviewers and others that if industry funds a trial, there is a bias towards the outcomes favouring the drug benefits and underestimating the harms. There's also a way of designing a clinical trial to underestimate harms. And the example of this is, a classic example is the heart protection study, where they design the trial with a run-in period. And this means that everybody goes on the statin for a period of 6 weeks. And at the end of the 6 weeks, 36% of the participants actually dropped out because of side effects and non-compliance. And then with this freshly culled population of people, they begin the clinical trial. So you can imagine at the end of the 5 or 6 years, the statin side effects are similar in placebo and intervention groups. And it's because most of the population has already dropped out in the run-in period. So we think this may explain why there's such a wildly different view of the statin side effects in the clinical trials, which is quite low, compared to the statin side effects seen in real-world populations, where doctors say it's probably around 25–30%. Now, we've already seen this in the previous talk. David effectively talked about exaggerated statistics. So reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease by taking a Lipitor by a third sounds quite significant, but that's a relative risk reduction. This is the table that it came from. So if you take a placebo, your risk of having heart disease or a heart attack is 3.1%, but if you take a statin, it drops down to 2%. So the relative reduction is 36%, but the absolute risk reduction was only 1.1%. And the reason this is important for doctors to relay to their patients about absolute risk reductions is that sometimes patients are just really having a lot of difficulty staying on these medications. They have muscle pains, they have memory fog, they might develop diabetes. So they might decide that a 1% reduction in having a heart attack is probably not worth all the side effects that they're experiencing. So this is really important for informed consent and transparency in the doctor-patient relationship. Another reason for skepticism is that there's a lot of secret and missing data when it comes to statin trials. The CTT collaboration is an influential group of researchers at Oxford University that's run by Professor Rory Collins, and they're actually the only group in the world that retains all of the raw data on the statin side effects. And they signed a legally binding agreement with the principal investigators of the clinical trials to say that they would not share this data with third parties. So in effect, we have to just have faith that they're doing the right thing when they're publishing their research, and it just doesn't allow independent researchers to scrutinise the data and authenticate the results. Now this is concerning because this particular group of people periodically publish meta-analyses which advocate the wider use of statins in the population, and they have been influential in changing the clinical guidelines. And they claim to be independent, but we know that this group has received over £260 million in, from statin manufacturers or the cholesterol-lowering medications. So an interesting thing happened for all these reasons that you can manipulate results in a clinical trial, they decided to introduce new regulations. So prior to 2004, they recognised that clinical trials had been tainted by scandals and flawed methodology. So this led to new regulations concerning the conduct of clinical trials in Europe and the US. And the intention was to safeguard patients and to lend credibility to subsequent trials. So what they suggested was that all the clinical trials need to be verified and registered in a recognised database, and clinicaltrials.gov is that database. So from 2005 onwards, if you want to run a clinical trial, you need to register it so that people understand what your goals are from the outset, and that you don't change the goalposts if you realise that the results are probably not going to turn out the way you intended them to. So I was interested to see how this change in regulations would have affected the statin clinical trials. Unfortunately, somebody did that analysis for me. So Robert Dobroff is a cardiologist here in the US, and he published this article in the American Journal of Medicine just recently. He looked at all of the cholesterol-lowering trials post change in regulations. So this table has been adapted from this paper, but I've picked out just the statin interventions. And it shows that since the regulations had changed, not a single clinical trial using a statin intervention has found a mortality benefit. So nobody lives longer. They also found that 2/3 of the trials did not even prevent cardiovascular disease. So most of our clinical guidelines are based on clinical trials that have happened before the change in the regulations, the 4S study, HPS study, ASCOT. So all of those trials that were done pre-regulations inform a lot of our clinical guidelines. But since the regulations have changed, this result is not consistent with any of the strong evidence that suggests that cholesterol lowering is a powerful intervention for the treatment of cardiovascular disease. So what do we do with all this missing data? Well, there was a landmark decision that happened several years ago, and it was through the work of Professor Peter Goetsche, who runs the Nordic Cochrane collaboration in Denmark. And he managed to convince the European Medicines Agency, which is the drug regulatory agency in Europe, so the FDA, similar to the FDA here in the US, to widen public access to documents, including clinical trial reports and protocols. And it took a long time and a lot of convincing, and they gave him lots of excuses, and people said it would never be achieved, but it was finally achieved. And so what this has done is essentially open up access to information about clinical trials that we've never seen before. These involve clinical study reports. And these clinical study reports, or CSRs, are specifically written for the drug regulators. And they contain substantially more information and detail about an intervention being tested than you would normally see in a peer-reviewed journal. So this is an untapped source of detail that doctors, let alone patients, ever see. The problem with CSRs is that they're abundant. So associated with one clinical trial, you could have 2,000 pages associated with it. So you need researchers who can sift through this information and gather the data. So imagine 2,000 pages of information about a clinical trial versus 5 pages or even 10 pages that doctors normally read in a peer-reviewed journal. That's a substantially different amount of information. And since clinical study reports have been available, there was a really interesting lesson from the Tamiflu scandal, which was researchers Tom Jefferson, Peter Doshi, Chris Del Mar. They were looking into the drug Tamiflu, which is a drug that governments around the world spent millions of dollars stockpiling in the event of a flu pandemic. Because based on the published data in peer-reviewed journals, it was understood that Tamiflu would reduce the symptoms of flu, it would reduce hospital complications and the influx of people attending hospitals during a flu pandemic. And so they spent a lot of money stockpiling this medication. Then Tom Jefferson and co-workers went and obtained the clinical study reports and spent I don't know how many hours sifting through the information, and they actually found that when they looked at all the data, that Tamiflu was no more effective than taking ordinary paracetamol, and that the harms had been underestimated, and in fact it didn't reduce hospital complications. So that was a really valuable lesson to governments who spend a lot of money formulating policy on just peer-reviewed journals, but also a valuable lesson to doctors who are prescribing these medications, because there's a whole lot of information that you've never had access to. So this was a really important development. Now, I've taken this from Peter Doshi, who was involved with the Tamiflu expose, and this is his depiction of the worldview of clinical trials. So these are icebergs, essentially, and the one on the left is the tip of the iceberg of a published trial. So normally we only see a journal article, in a peer-reviewed journal article and a conference poster, if you're lucky. But under the surface, there lies all of the clinical study reports and electronic patient-level data. So that's information that we don't get to see, only the regulators get to see. Because of that decision from the EMA, a lot of this information has opened up. And that's for a published trial. There's a whole load of trials that are never published and never see the light of day. So you can imagine how much information there is. I'd be interested to know how the trials on statins change when we gain access to clinical study reports. So I just want to finish off by talking about the challenges that people face in questioning the statin data. I've shown you the reasons why they should be questioned, but it's not so easy to do. So public discourse has been difficult in Australia, and I've had experience with it, but there are many ways to silence dissenting views. And one of them is through publications. And I think it was 2016, there was a 30-page review that was done by researchers, published in a high-profile journal called The Lancet, claiming to end the statin debate once and for all. And so this received international attention, and journalists were not very questioning of the results. The simple message was that you need to take statins, otherwise you'll die of a heart attack. So that was incredibly influential. Another way of silencing dissenting views is to discredit them. And Professor Collins, Rory Collins from the CTT collaboration does a pretty good job of this. He said in the media that anyone who questioned the statin side effects were far worse and had probably killed more people than the paper on the MMR vaccine. So pretty dramatic words for scientists who are really simply just trying to question the data. And of course, cardiologist Professor Steve Nissen from the Cleveland Clinic recently said we need to push back on anybody challenging statins because they're part of an internet cult. I think he was including me in that. Now, censorship is the last thing I will talk about because I've been personally involved in it. And it was regarding documentaries that I produced in 2013. I might get a show of hands. Who's familiar with the Heart of the Matter program? Okay, so there's a few. I'll go through the situation and what happened. So 2013, I was working for the ABC, and this two-part series involved, the first part was Dietary Villains, which essentially questioned the role of saturated fat and its ability to cause heart disease by raising cholesterol. And the second part of the series looked at cholesterol-lowering medications, or specifically statins, and we talked about the overprescription of statins, particularly in the low-risk or primary prevention population. These are people who have not had a heart attack or stroke. Now, when these programs went to air, they were incredibly popular. They rated through the roof. And of course, ABC management was pleased, and we got a lot of emails congratulating us on these great programs. And what surprised me also was the amount of feedback that we were getting from viewers, and hundreds of emails and social media calls and letters written to the ABC congratulating us on finally, debating something like this in mainstream medicine, because it just hadn't been heard of in Australia before. And so all was going well until we started to receive complaints. And the first complaint came from the Heart Foundation of Australia. They said the programs were dangerous. I suspect that they were very concerned that people were going to start eating cheese and eggs and whipped cream and die of a heart attack. And so they were incredibly influential, and we also had complaints from Pfizer, Merck Sharp and Dohme, and AstraZeneca, which are the three largest statin manufacturers. And there was a lot of misrepresentation of what the programs actually said, but because the ABC put a gag order on me, I wasn't able to contest a lot of this mischaracterization in the media. So it was very hard to have a proper debate about this. So this sparked national headlines, and these were the kinds of, so these are real headlines, so it's not even debatable, so not even willing to debate this. Saturated fat is bad for you. Then someone within the ABC network said the cholesterol programs will kill people, people will die if they watch this program, and statin programs contribute to deaths. These are real, like in our national papers. And one cardiologist actually recommended that people contact Slater and Gordon, which is a legal personal injury law firm, and they were encouraging people to sue the ABC if anybody watched the program and had a heart attack. And of course, ABC has blood on its hands. So this was pretty dramatic. The programs were accused of essentially we were being accused of mass murder. So they were saying that thousands and thousands of people had gone off their medications, and this would contribute to 2,900 potentially fatal heart attacks and strokes. So, very unscientific commentary in the media. And I guess it got too much for the ABC. They did an investigation into these programs. It took 6 months to investigate, and they came out saying that both programs were factually accurate, which was good because I worked for factual programming, but they found that part 2, the statins program, favoured more the anti-statin side than it did the pro-statin side, and therefore the programs were biased, and they decided to retract the programs and take them off the website. Take them off the website, and so they're not available on the ABC anymore. But if you're good at Googling, you could probably still find them on the internet, because I know that people still upload them out of protest. So that was a very unfortunate scare campaign that happened. Thank you. So that was a very unfortunate scare campaign because it really damaged the conversation that patients could have been having with their doctors. And in fact, it was a small but very vocal group of doctors that were complaining, and they came out in the media saying, they were just so angry that patients were coming to them and questioning their medications. And I found that quite extraordinary because that was the whole purpose of my programs, so that we could inform patients so that they could educate themselves and go to their doctors and question their medications. And this was the very thing that was the bugbear for the doctors. So it was very unfortunate. I'm just going to mention briefly a scare campaign that happened in France, very similar to my situation, but it had a very different outcome at the end. So same year, in 2013, there was widespread media attention when a French cardiologist questioned the value of statins in a new book. And a report came out saying that the book was responsible for causing a 50% increase in statin discontinuation. So lots of people going off their statins. They extrapolated that this would result in 10,000 deaths. Major drama. But this time, researchers went and looked at the actual number of deaths reported on national statistics, and they confirmed that the actual number of deaths decreased in the year after all of this supposed media hype. So the authors commented saying that it was not evidence-based to claim that statin discontinuation increases mortality, and that in the future, scientists should assess the real effects of statin discontinuation rather than making dubious extrapolations and calculations. And I think I tend to agree with that. So in summary, there's a lot of skepticism about statins, mainly because we've had constantly changing thresholds of what we call high cholesterol or our risk markers. We have a lot of industry bias because the vast majority of clinical trials are funded by statin manufacturers. We know that when industry sponsors their own trials, they can design a trial in a way that underestimates the harms. We've got a lot of missing data that we've never seen before, and as a result of this, there's a lack of independent scrutiny of the harms around statins. And of course, we've seen a lot of censorship and a lot of scare campaigns. So I think in the future, there will be studies that will look at the regulatory data, and I think this is the direction that we're headed. And I do know for a fact that Tom Jefferson, who was involved in the Tamiflu expose, has managed to get access to the clinical study reports of statins, and his early results are very interesting. So stand by, because I think this will really tell us what the true value of statins are and the true harms are. So thank you for listening.
You have time to answer. You can ask a few questions.
Sure.
Hey, so for the first time in the history of conferences, we're ahead of schedule. And so we have time for 2 questions if anybody would like to ask a question right now of Dr. Demasi.
Hi.
Hi, great presentation. So I came across recently a YouTube video from Chris Masterjohn with Dr. McCullough back in 2012. Mm-hmm. And we actually have a real-life nature experiment on the zero LDL hypothesis. So 1 out of 1,000 people have a mutation where they cannot synthesize cholesterol. It has to be homozygous, it would be 1 out of 10,000, except it's 1 out of 60,000 because there's lots of natural abortions. So that's a real life, doesn't have to be a trial, what happens when you can't synthesize cholesterol. So those kids, and very few, I think, make it for a long life, have most of the adverse effects of lowering LDL. So nature's already run that experiment.
Indeed.
And so I thought.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Juliana. I'm a PhD student at the University of Texas Medical Branch. And I would like to ask 2 questions. So you mentioned the number needed to treat. So you treat 100 patients and 1 potentially benefits. Could you comment on the number needed to harm, so NNH? So how many people you treat, or if you don't treat, how many could possibly be harmed?
I don't know them off the top of my head. There might be someone in the audience that does, but I suspect that they equal or sometimes exceed the number needed to treat. So the last time I looked at it, the number of side effects to statins equaled the harms of statins equaled the reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. So you didn't get an overall benefit from statins. I'm sorry, I can't recall the numbers off the top of my head, but there is a website that you can go to, the nnt.com, and put in statins for cardiovascular disease or statins without cardiovascular disease, and it'll give you the numbers straight away.
Thank you. And I appreciate what you said, that sometimes pharmacological companies do, in fact, run clinical trials. But concerning the idea of a randomized clinical trial to assess a chronic disease such as cardiovascular disease, which takes many years and a long term to actually develop, could you comment on, I mean, we know that randomized controlled trials or, systematic reviews or meta-analyses of those help us to provide the best evidence, for or against taking a certain medication. But in the idea of a randomized controlled trial, which ideally is grant funded for a period of perhaps 5 years or less, that period of time may not be the most appropriate length to actually, assess a chronic disease, which may take longer than 5 years to develop. So I'm wondering if you have any ideas of how to better assess the effect of a medication for a disease that takes, 10, 15 years to develop.
Well, the early clinical trials, like the 4S study and the HPS study, ASCOT trials, they were able, they went for 7 odd years, and they were able to establish a reduction in mortality. So it was enough time for them to look at a mortality reduction. The trials that have happened since the regulations were introduced in 2005, they're quite short. So we saw the Jupiter study was stopped at 1.9 years. So it's those trials that will struggle to find a mortality benefit and why we don't see it. So I suspect that if clinical trials were run 5 to 7 years, you would see a mortality benefit, because we've seen that in the past. That's if the statin does provide a mortality benefit. So there have been clinical trials that have gone long enough to actually establish that.
Okay, and thank you so much. And one final question. We do have longitudinal studies in the United States, so they take a large group of people and they follow them from, birth to however old they get. So, for example, the Framingham Heart Study has effectively done that, where they follow a population from beginning to wherever they are now. And could you comment on if there's any data currently, I'm not aware, of any maybe statin use, or even, I know that you're the statin person, but perhaps LDL as well, in longitudinal studies, for example, the Framingham study?
I know that the US had a statin usage study, and that was people who were taking medications. I don't know for how long, but their endpoint was really looking at discontinuation. So I know that most people that take statins, after a year, I think it's 72% stop taking statins, and around 60% of them stop taking statins because of the side effects. But I'm not familiar with any other data.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much.
No worries.